Welcome to Pérez Art Museum, Miami. My name is Adrienne Chadwick, and I'm the Deputy Director of Education here at the museum. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you also to our speakers and also to the staff who put this exhibition and tonight's event together. So before we start, our speakers have asked that we invite everyone to come down closer to the bottom of the auditorium. So if everyone will do that, and thank you. At least to the second half of the auditorium. Thank you. Perfect. Tonight, Susan Hiller, an influential pioneer of video and multimedia installation art, in conversation with PAMM Curator René Morales, will discuss Hiller's newly commissioned video work, Lost and Found, which revolves around the theme of extinct, endangered, and revitalized languages. Following the discussion, we'll have a short Q&A. Tonight, this talk will be streamed live on PAMM's Facebook, so please follow along, invite your friends who are not with us today, and you can comment as the discussion goes on. Please remember to silence your cell phones. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. René Morales is a curator at Pérez Art Museum, Miami, where he has organized over 36 exhibitions, including Global Positioning Systems, Victoria Gitman, Desiring Eye, Monica Sosnowski, Market, and A Human Document, selections from the Sackner Archive of Concrete and Visual Poetry. René received a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College and a master's degree of art history from Brown University. Prior to joining PAMM, he worked at the Museum of Art, Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Susan Hiller was born in Tallahassee and lived in and around Cleveland, Ohio, before her family moved to South Florida in 1952. She attended Ponce de Leon Junior High School and Coral Gables High School, and in 1961 she received a BA from Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and then spent a year in New York studying photography at the Cooper Union and linguistics at Hunter College before receiving a National Science Foundation Fellowship to study for a PhD in anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans. In 1965, she decided to become a professional artist, and with her partner, writer David Coxhead, moved to London, where she is still based. Major retrospectives of Hiller's work have been organized by the Institute for Contemporary Art, London, and Tate Britain, London. Other solo exhibitions have been presented at venues including the Jewish Museum of New York, Generale Foundation, Vienna, Castello de Rivoli, Turin, Wexner Center for the Arts, Columbus, Museo Salravas, Portugal, Freud Museum, London, Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, and the Serpentine Gallery, London, among others. Hiller is a recipient of several prestigious awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship in Visual Arts Practice and the Gulbenkian Foundation Visual Arts Award, and the Berlin DAAD Fellowship. Her work is included in numerous major museum collections, so please join me in welcoming our speakers, René Morales and Susan Hiller.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you so much, Susan, for making the long journey here to Miami to be with us tonight. And thank you so much for creating this beautiful piece. And welcome back, I should say. As you all know, Susan grew up here part of the time, but you've been here a couple times over the years. So. But let me just dive right in to the piece. Of course, the piece is called Lost and Found. You've all had a few minutes to stare at this introductory screen, this slide here. And by lost and found, of course, we're referring to lost and found languages, right? To be a bit literal about the piece. So on that note, Susan, would you like to start us off just by describing the project in your own words, talking a little bit about just basically what it consists of, particularly for those who haven't had a chance to see it.
Okay. Lost and Found is a 30-minute video program. I think of it as basically an audio work with kind of visual accompaniments. And it's a kind of, let's call it a collage or a composition of the voices of people speaking languages that either are already extinct or are endangered. They speak in a variety of ways. Sometimes they're speaking about their language, sometimes they're telling a story, sometimes they're singing, etc., etc. And the piece is composed in a way so that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we're trying to ask people, if you have time, just to come in at the beginning of the piece so you get a sense of the transition between the languages that are already extinct, those that are endangered, and the ones that I've put at the end of the piece, which are revived languages. So it ends on a slightly optimistic note.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about that. I was going to mention that the piece begins on the hour and on the half hour. So if possible, try to see it from the beginning. So this is just one example of the speakers that you've compiled together. This was a person named Doris Lamar who actually just passed away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
very recently, yeah.
Yeah. This is one of the cases where you really get, I think, a strong emotive charge just listening to her words, listening to what she's saying. In some of the cases, in the case of some of the selections, you get this strong sense of melancholy, if not actual grief, about the sense of isolation that these speakers are finding themselves in. But as you said, in other cases, it's much more banal or kind of casual. They're talking about car problems or reading the weather report or something like that. So there is this kind of variation in emotional tone. So I wonder if you could speak about that a little bit.
I approach this from an artist's perspective. I mean, I'm interested in making a composition that makes a sort of musical sense, if you like. I think there's a great pleasure in listening to people speaking many, many different languages and making all sorts of interesting sounds with their voices. So there's that level. And then there's something else which is at stake, which is the situation of many of the world's languages. So there are two things going on, really. Part of it you could think of as a musical kind of element. And of course, music can have tragic notes as well as joyous ones. And then there's the constant reminder through subtitles that are part of the work of the actual situation of the language, from vulnerable, these are classifications that UNESCO gives various languages, vulnerable to moribund, to etc., like that, or revived, dormant, revived, etc., etc. So the very many different ways of kind of experiencing the work, and of course the tone varies, and that's a deliberate part of my decision as to make it like that. I mean, I wasn't just interested in presenting the facts that most of us are already familiar with, which is that languages are dying just like butterflies, birds, and other animals, and for very clear reasons, but also the fact that human beings have this incredible capacity with the numerous languages, which are all incredibly different one from the other, that each present a worldview that is distinct, and that's actually what we lose when we lose a language. So if people are talking about cars, that's something we can relate to. They're talking about the car problems, not being able to get their car to start. Well, yes, you know, but it's in a completely different language, and the whole thing is phrased very differently, and so forth.
Yeah, just going back to this term, dormant, you mentioned that this term has become the more correct way of referring to what we
Yes,
earlier might have called extinct.
I used various terms. I did use extinct, but extinct is now, I suppose, not considered politically correct. They say moribund, which of course means dead. So I don't really think that's much nicer than extinct myself. But that isn't used so much either, because a number of people have popped up in some of these supposedly extinct languages. They may be the only person left, and they never speak their native language, but the language isn't dead. The language is just dormant. And if it's dormant, that means sleeping. You can wake it up. And so there are various groups of people who are trying to wake up their languages, which were previously thought to be moribund. And that interests me very, very much. And there are a number of the speakers to address that very point. I mean, and just make an example. For example, Cornish. Cornwall is a part of England, part of the United Kingdom. And the Cornish language actually hadn't been spoken for 200 years. But it was documented, and people revived it, and they're speaking it now. So, you know, it wasn't dead. Full of paradoxes, I think, language.
Let's go on to another dormant language, Livonian. Where is Livonian spoken?
Well, the speaker, she's the last native speaker, was actually recorded in Canada, because she emigrated to Canada, but it was Livonia is part of Lithuania. It was part of Lithuania. In fact, there was the Kingdom of Livonia at one time. But they were a minority group in greater Lithuania. And she talks about her school days and the fact that they weren't taught Livonian, and the language just gradually disappeared. There are a small number of people who still speak it. She's not really the last speaker, but she was the last person who spoke it as an everyday language. And yeah, that's Livonian.
So, and that brings up an interesting point also with Berber and Breton. You know, many of these languages are from, languages you've selected are from Tasmania or small Caribbean islands, places that seem remote
Actually,
from the
most
Western.
of them are from the United States. Native American languages.
Right. I was going to say, but several are, closer to what we think of as Western language
European
groups,
languages.
like Breton, for example.
Or Arabic, yeah.
Right. So, I think for some of us, we might have this impression that these endangered languages or the endangerment of languages is a phenomenon
Exotic,
that
yeah.
is exotic or remote, something pertaining to, a geographic, cultural, ethnic, racial other. But in fact, languages can slip away from us right from beneath our noses.
Well, they don't slip. I'm sorry to correct you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I deliberately included some European languages that are endangered. Okay, how can I explain this? Two factors. One, let's say Breton, Brittany. It was an independent part of France, and it became part of France, and the French started to forbid people to speak Breton. Just like we people in this country tried to suppress all the Native American languages. So that's exactly the same thing. They talk about their school days. They weren't allowed to speak their languages. They were in boarding schools away from their families. Whole generations of people were deprived of their native languages to an extent, because they still spoke them, but not as an everyday language. They were, in a way, being forcibly inducted into the dominant language, whether it was French in the case of Breton or English in the case of the United States, of course. And yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think people do tend to feel that this is something that it's got a kind of inevitability to it. But of course it doesn't. There are always circumstances that put pressure onto a language. And a lot of it is a kind of forceful and very unpleasant history to actually go into. And it's tragic for the people who've endured it. And some of them speak about it in this piece.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll pose this as a question. Would you agree that there is kind of right underneath the surface of this discussion a very strong political dimension having to do with power and the relative empowerment or disempowerment of a particular group?
Yes, you know, for example, I mentioned Cornish, Manx, Gaelic, Celtic, all those things in the United Kingdom were populations of people who were struggling against the dominant rule of the English, and so their languages were considered subversive. And the English didn't want people speaking in Welsh to each other because they couldn't understand what they were saying, and so forth and so on. And that's the kind of power situation that in a general sense has forced a lot of languages to disappear. But also there's now the pressure of the big languages. So English, Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin, for example, are quickly suppressing inadvertently small language communities who will, of course, perhaps still speak their language, but only within the family. But for all public matters, they will speak the dominant language. And that seems to be one of the main pressures now that's forcing languages to not be spoken. People just don't see the use of it, you know.
I wonder if you could expand a bit on what you've come across in your research regarding efforts to revitalize and revive these languages. For example, in the educational system that you mentioned, have you come across efforts to start teaching some of these languages in schools?
Absolutely. But you know, I keep saying I'm not an expert on any of this, but yeah, Welsh. Welsh is taught in Wales in every school now. So, you know, many English-speaking people have homes in Wales, and their children are learning Welsh in school. But whether they will ever become Welsh speakers remains to be seen. It's a sort of an experiment. Yeah.
You mean in the sense that it's one thing to speak a language, it's another thing to think in that language?
Yes, to think in that language and to feel that's the way you want to talk all the time. And then another aspect of this that we were speaking about, let's say Hawaiian, is being now taught in schools also, but there's a big debate going on about whether it is actually Hawaiian or it just seems to be Hawaiian, because the concepts that go with the Hawaiian are not native to the English-speaking kids who are being taught Hawaiian, if you see what I mean. So they're not getting the worldview except in a very small way. And so there are discussions about whether languages can really be revived in that sense. But then in this piece, for example, there is a weather report from a radio station in New Mexico, and the weather report is in Navajo. And it's interesting for a number of reasons, because he gives the Navajo place names, but you see the English names in the subtitles, and it's a kind of history of the West, Fort Defiance or Big Mountain, or it's the names are fantastic. Anyway, Navajo people still speak Navajo because there are more than 25,000 Navajo, so numbers of the population have a lot to do with it. That's a big group of Native American people who have got their language and they are speaking their language. And they have a radio station and so forth and so on. But of course, they are bilingual. They all speak absolutely perfect English. And so the question is, what use is Navajo going to have in the future? Aside from the fact that we all know in World War II, the Navajo and other Native American speakers were used for code because nobody could break the code. You all know that, yeah? Yeah. I mean, are people nodding? I can't see anybody.
It's hard to see with these lights. But,
anyway, but you know, the question is, what use will Navajo be in their public life? Is it always just going to be a kind of family and tribal language? And the same is true of Welsh. Welsh people all speak English, of course. You know.
And there's another very important issue that you've alluded to a couple of times, which is that you know, one could argue that you can't dissect a language from its culture without losing a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about the language; it's about the culture, the knowledge, the worldview.
Yeah, exactly.
This whole system of looking at the world that is implied.
That's the thing that is gradually getting lost. But of course, preserving a language, for example, go back to Navajo again, does preserve it if there are enough people who speak it as native speakers. But when you try to teach it to people who've never really known it, even if the person is from that group, but they never spoke it, but they now decide they want to speak it, raises all sorts of interesting questions. But my point about all of this is that we shouldn't be necessarily so negative about the situation of languages, because if people want to revive them, they do. I mean, there are many instances where they do. Yeah. For example, there's one of the optimistic instances in Lost and Found is Maori, which is the native language of the original inhabitants of New Zealand. Well, the national anthem is in both English and Maori. And everybody does do some Maori in school, but the Maoris nevertheless remain a kind of marginal group, I would say, within white New Zealand. But they are, the country as a whole officially makes a huge point of having a national anthem in Maori, as does South Africa. And so there are all these, to me, very fascinating points. But what I want to say about the work that's here is that it isn't about these things unless you notice these elements. It's not a lesson, a lecture about language loss. It's a kind of experience of sound, of different sounds that human beings make, from incredible clicks to kind of, well, I don't know, there's a language of people whistling. I mean, people are incredible. They can do all these things, so, yeah.
I would say, just to get back to the piece, this is, it's incredibly fascinating subject matter. It's very easy to get lost in that discussion. But the piece itself, to return to that, you know, I agree with you. It's very much about, the piece is very much about this experience of sound. But there's certainly visual dimensions to it. Of course, there's all the choices, all the formal choices that you made in creating this image. There's the use of this green oscilloscopic line, which please, I invite you to expand on that. But I think there's another really important visual aspect in the piece, which is a bit paradoxical in that it's not visual. It's generally, I mean, you're looking at a real scarcity of visual information in a sense. It's a very dark piece, literally dark. But at the same time, as you sit in the piece and listen to these people speaking, I keep finding myself visualizing all sorts of imagery. landscape. Certainly, a lot of landscape is evoked in this piece. Um, um, Certainly, I find myself visualizing the speakers themselves.
Yeah.
How old they are, their gender, what they might actually look like. Um, there's this very strong personal connection that you make with the speakers after you spend some time with the speakers.
Well, that's why I don't have pictures of them, because we were talking about this before. Storytelling is an ancient human art, and it enables us to make our own pictures, and in a way that has more intimacy. And I'm very interested in empathetic relationships through sound with other human beings, because when you're looking at something, you're always looking at it from a distance, but when you're listening to something, the vibrations, the audio element is actually touching, vibrating physically in your ear. And I think that's a very interesting part of listening to other human voices saying something to you. So the voice isn't a representation of a person, it's a kind of evocation of a person. And that's really what I was attempting to do with this particular piece, was to create an intimacy which isn't present when we talk about the problems of languages disappearing and so forth and so on, but to get to know the people through their voices, really. Because the voice is the person to a large extent.
And to a large extent, what you were just talking about is what we're looking at here. This line really represents the physical interaction of sound waves with the human body as it resonates as you speak, and also as it hits your ears. So it's really, in that sense, it's the body that creates a bridge between all of these different speakers and with the viewer.
I'm glad you said that, because to me that's really the important part of this. It's the bond that's established, whether we like it or not, when someone's voice hits our ear, and that's part of, if I'm going to say what I'm trying to say in this piece, that's where it lies, in that part of it,
And this question of a connection by means of the human voice, it's something that you've explored in several pieces in the past.
Yes, I started using sound 1980. I made a piece called Monument, which you sit on a park bench and you listen to somebody on headphones.
We actually have a slide of that. Would you like to?
Yeah, sure.
It's,
and from that point onward, I've become increasingly fascinated with the elements of voice that one can use to create work,
Well, I want to leave time for questions, so I don't necessarily want to dive into this piece, but I'll give you another example that I think is a very prominent example of your use of the human voice. This work, Witness. Would you like to talk about this one a little bit? No? Would you rather talk about Monument?
No, I don't want to talk about any of them, because I don't know what I'm doing here. No, the reason I don't want to talk about them is because I make work for people to experience. And again, this talking about work, which artists have to do all the time now, is a distancing thing. And anyway, what I say about the work isn't necessarily what you're going to say about it. But I can just say something very boring about the Witness. It's upside down. No, it isn't, René. I'm joking. It's not upside down.
Keeps me on my toes.
Witness is an installation with 300 hanging little loudspeakers. And so there are 300 voices or more speaking, and they speak all at once. And it creates like an ocean of sound. But you can walk amongst them and pick up them and put them to your ear, and then you hear an individual voice. It's about that kind of thing.
Well, one aspect about this piece that you were talking about, I think relates nicely to what we were just talking about, this idea of visualization, the ways that the audio evokes all sorts of imagery.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how
Oh, yeah, I have
the
to
way
talk
people
about this one,
reacted,
yeah, okay.
visitors reacted to this piece.
Well, you know, this piece, I didn't want to go into this really, but this piece is people talking about their experiences of having seen UFOs and other things. No, we're not going to talk about that now. But most people that I know approach this piece with great skepticism. However, when you hear 300 people all telling you their stories, and you inevitably visualize, as one does when someone tells you a story, you start putting yourself in the picture, you know. You begin to think, oh, and so many people have said to me afterwards, well, I didn't think that I would even want to hear their stories, but I got so fascinated by listening, by the act of listening to people, that it's a different experience than talking about people's reports about seeing UFOs. That's all I can say. And I've learned through these works the power of the voice to affect people on many levels that we're not even conscious of a lot of the time. And I think with people like politicians and so forth, the voice, the effect the voice has on us, which is different, you know, we'll each react differently, but it's really an important element.
Yeah, I think that relates very much, I think, to what you were saying, the power of the voice to create a kind of a bridge by means of empathy between the speaker and the person listening, whether it's a museum goer or someone standing right in front of them. And that's something that comes through very strongly in this piece, and this piece that we have installed upstairs. And it's certainly something that doesn't quite have the same effect in an ethnographic context, in the context of an ethnographic archive, or at least it wasn't. Those kinds of archives were obviously not put together with those kinds of.
Well, they're not orchestrated. I mean, they're for a different purpose. They're for a kind of scrutiny. But I mean, I've recycled a lot of them in this piece, and they have a different way of affecting people. You know, I'm interested in empathy, intimacy, a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with the way these languages are treated by social science. So it's hard to imagine what it would be like for people to go into an archive and listen. Maybe it would be very enchanting in a way, but the public is never allowed. You see, they collect, oh, don't get me started on this. They collect these languages and then they don't allow anyone to listen. And why is that? It's extraordinary to me. So the language is lost twice. You know, why shouldn't academic archives be open to the public to listen to? Why don't they put it all online, for example? You know, it's strange.
Yeah. And especially when we're talking about language, which feels like it feels like it's something that should resist any kind of proprietary claim. You know, language feels like it belongs to all of us, and the loss of a language feels like a loss for all of us, right?
Well, but then there is the other side of this. For example, I mentioned to you that there were some languages that I would have liked to know more about and perhaps to incorporate into this work, but the speakers of that particular language don't want anyone to have access to it. And the reason for that is, particularly in the United States, that a lot of Native American groups feel that their words or their names have been appropriated, like Apache war helicopters. They don't like that. The Apache people didn't give permission, you know, for that. So there are all these other issues about who owns the language and etc. It's very complicated, yeah.
Well, I'm seeing. I'd like to, like I said, I'd like to leave some time for questions. So let me turn it over to the audience. We are recording this tonight, so if you could just raise your hand and wait for someone to come by with a microphone, we'd really appreciate that. Do we have any questions?
both of you. Just one question for each of you. I mean, for Susan, could you talk a little bit about your or share with us a little bit of your working process, or a little bit of how you do research, or you know, how you think about a project of this kind, or go about a project of this kind? And then, and Renee, I might ask you to talk a little bit about what drew you to Susan's work for us here in Miami. Yeah.
You could go first.
You want me to go first? Okay, sure.
I have to think.
Well, I've followed Susan's work for a long time, and I think it's very important, and it's been recognized more and more as an important, very early adaptation of a mode. And I'm not just talking about, you know, the use of these installation formats, the use of video, use of audio, sound work in contemporary art, but I'm talking at a more conceptual level. Some of the ideas that she's pursued in her work, I see them resonating through a lot of work being made still today. And it's been recognized more and more in England in particular and throughout Europe, but I think her work is under-recognized here in the States, so I think that was an important motivation. Susan is from Miami, but I actually did not, or she grew up here, but I actually didn't even know that until after I had first made contact and definitely first started doing research into her work. But it is nice to have that connection on some level, and certainly the work that she ended up creating for this project has very nice resonances with the city. This is, of course, a very polylingual city where you hear all sorts of languages, not just Spanish in all of its iterations, but Portuguese. And in fact, you hear all sorts of, not very often, but every once in a while you'll hear a very kind of understood, not very well understood patois language from some of these small Caribbean islands, et cetera. And so it's a very fascinating city from the point of view of linguistics. As a matter of fact, one of the languages that you selected is from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, and ended up later in Honduras and Central America. It's a language that's really fascinating in that it's a direct hybrid, a merger of African languages with indigenous Caribbean Arawak languages.
And Caribou.
So, I mean, that's so fascinating,
Yeah.
that whole
Yeah,
idea.
it is.
And the idea that it actually is spoken. I looked it up on the internet. It is spoken here in Miami.
Yeah.
There are speakers of this language here in this language. What is the language again? Garifano. Yeah.
No, in
So,
fact, it's the United Nations. UNESCO has given it a, what do they call it? You know, and it's a cultural. Yeah, exactly. And it's the only actual language they've given this to, because it combines three sources. And the Arawak and Carib part of it, they were two hostile groups who came together at a certain point, and then the Africans had escaped from a slave ship that crashed, and they formed this very viable, vivid culture. And they had both a male and a female language, which of course, I find this amazing. How do they talk to each other? I mean, you know. Yes, and they were seafarers and so forth, and there are many of them came to Florida. So that was a nice coincidence, wasn't it? Yeah. But René also had mentioned to me that there were various other speakers of small languages here in Florida, and I think that's wonderful. Yeah. And then I was supposed to answer something. What was it about? My work. Well, you know, it's like saying to somebody, well, how do you do a painting? Well, first you stretch the canvas, you know, and go out and buy some paint. And you know, my research method is rather messy. It's not like focused. to a point where this is what I'm looking for. I just start by wandering around different sources that interest me. So in this case, it included some academic archives, some old ethnographic films, various things like that. And listened and read and just kind of spent a lot of time, a lot of time, immersing myself in the whole area. And then gradually, as with anything like that, a focus just made itself visible. And it was from that point onwards, I felt I knew what I was doing, and I could make choices of what to include and what not to include and why. And it all became very clear. Once I'd done it, I knew what I had done, but I didn't know what I was going to do when I started.
Yes, a couple of questions. Yes.
First of all, I haven't had a chance to see the piece, but I'm very interested too. I was curious, the examples you showed, the green lines, are those, I believe it's sine patterns?
It's a
The
oscilloscope.
sound waves?
It's sine waves. Yeah.
Those are the sound
Yeah,
waves?
yeah.
And I was also wondering, as you dealt with the languages, did you listen to them in your creation of the work? And I know language has an effect on our paradigm, how we perceive reality. And did you work with some of the languages enough to kind of get into them? And did they affect your creation process for individual languages?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because, you see, I also got involved in a lot of things that aren't in the work, that didn't end up in the work. For example, the way languages that were not written languages, how they have chosen to express themselves now, what kind of alphabets they're using, what kind of sign symbols. You know, for example, with Berber, which is a very widespread across North Africa language, the problem is that the Berber people are in 3 or 4 different countries, and each of these countries has decided on a different alphabet to express Berber, so they're not getting anywhere, really, in terms of developing a written culture. So all of that, none of that's in the work. I have pages of alphabets from all these languages. But I don't think, in terms of what you're asking, if I can actually say that I did get into them like that. No. Are you interested in languages, particularly?
I'm interested in a lot of different things. I was actually really interested in, you said how, was it the Native Americans, I believe it was, didn't want to share their language because we couldn't understand. We could use the words, but we couldn't evoke the reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting way. And I guess I'm also curious, is that something you deal with in using language to, like
Well,
art, to create a reality?
I don't know, but I certainly learned a lot. For example, the Navajo, who are very active in maintaining and preserving their language, and I have this radio excerpt of the weather report in Navajo. And he ends by saying, this is, you know, from little whatever, and then he goes, and what's a sound I can't make? And I had gone and looked at Navajo language lessons. And you see, they start by saying, this is how we say hello in Navajo, goodbye, how are you? And then at the end of one set of language lessons, the man teaching says, but actually, he said, actually, if you were Navajo, you wouldn't do any of that. You would just go up to someone and go, and let them talk. You don't ask questions, you don't, you know. So all these language lessons, you know. It's like, how old are you? And I am, you know, and where do you live? And they don't do it like that. But they have a way of doing it, but that is hard to transmit.
Right.
So, yes, I suppose if you lived with a Navajo for a while, you would learn the language from a Navajo point of view. But if you're being taught it from the basis of vocabulary and so forth, you're not learning Navajo, really.
Right.
That's the point, yeah.
We have a question in the back.
You talk about a language becoming dormant and about the history of the background of the language. I'm curious to know what you've discovered with a language that has been dormant for a period of time. And when it's revived, how much of the background is reclaimed? And how is that reclaimed? Through storytelling or through history? And attached to that, who revives the language? What element of the population is interested in bringing it back? Is it academic, or is it social, or is it historical? Or? Thank you.
Well, I mean, this again is, I'm not an expert, and I think each language has its own micro-history in terms of revival attempts, but you can tell from some of the evidence in this work that's here, Lost and Found, that sometimes if you read the credits at the end, you'll see that there will have been an initial group of people who wanted to maintain their language, and quite often they link up with the university or a program. The federal government here gives a lot of grants now for language revival, but there have to be some people who really, really, really want this to happen. Some activists, so to speak. And then, if, as in the case of Welsh, it grows as a strong political feeling that people have about their language, then there is a chance that the language will flourish and people will really be speaking it. There aren't many examples of truly revived languages. Hebrew is the one that's always given. But of course, as it turns out, if you read up about Israeli Hebrew, it has very little to do with Hebrew. And young Israelis reading the Bible, let's say, in Hebrew are as confused by it as we are. I mean, because the Hebrew that they're speaking is so distant from the original Hebrew. And in my piece, there is an example of Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke, of course. And there are a number of different groups of Aramaic speakers scattered all over the Middle East. But they are very much in decline. And they're not making any attempt, I think, to revive the language. Each language is different. I mean, I think you could probably wander along many paths to answer the question that you asked.
Hi. So I have a much more general question. I think I was really struck by your comments about empathy and intimacy, particularly empathy and intimacy with an absent or an absent present, like person.
Yes.
And it seems like a very a recurring thing that you engage with in your work. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, it's not really a theme I address overtly. I've discovered this through using sound. Do you understand what I'm saying? I've discovered that it has this effect. And I've discovered that the storytelling element of art is something that is very important to art in general, and partly I've begun to emphasize that more in my work by using sound. It's a kind of circular answer to your question. Do you want to say something else about that? No?
Well, if I may, I would add that I think it's very important to note here that you took a format, these various conceptual art formats that had so purposefully tried to keep out that level of empathy, and you interjected that into your work and into the practice as a whole.
Well, yeah.
And if you look, for those art history wonks out there, there's there are certain landmarks that you can point to in that the history of that interjection. I mean, there's Felix Gonzalez Torres, certainly, but I mean, you were doing that earlier. Not that it's a race, but I think it's just significant to point it out.
Yeah, because that's why I always call myself a second-generation conceptualist. It's not that I was second-generation. I mean, I'm the same age as the first-generation conceptualist, but I didn't really, I wasn't at ease with that attempt to cut out the personal entirely. I don't think you can cut out the personal, so I began to emphasize it a little bit. But it's particularly with the use of human voices that this comes into my work as an important element, and perhaps increasingly so. I hadn't realized that till you showed those slides, but it is something that seems to be coming up more now in my work. And I find it very interesting that, I mean, as René was saying, the effect of listening to these people but not having pictures of them may, for some of you, give you a very active sense of who they are and of having some kind of empathetic relationship with them. Maybe. I'm not saying it will happen, but it might happen.
Well, thank you, Susan. This has been
Thank you.
great. Thank you all for coming.